I'm John Stanton, editor of The Gambit, and this is The Get Down. I'm joined by J.P. Morrell, who is the president, as everyone knows, of the New Orleans City Council, and he's also our very first guest. So thanks for coming on, J.P. Appreciate you.
I am either super honored or about to be super embarrassed. I don't know which yet, but I will roll with it. Whatever it is, John and I have a great, robust, I would say, unfiltered relationship. So I'm sure this will go in a lot of different, interesting ways.
Emma can always tell when I'm talking to you because of she can either hear you through the phone or she can hear me laughing in the back room. So yeah. Well, let's start off with something easy.
Okay.
I don't know if you saw last week. There was a story that was about people in Lafayette putting the seasoning on the crawfish after they've been boiled.
I had not heard that, but that sounds very unholy.
Yeah, right? It feels like a sin. You know?
Well, I mean, what it does is, on one hand, crawfish properly boiled is seasoned. So is that like a commentary on badly boiled crawfish? Because
that's what I think.
It's like, did they just boil it in like hot dog water or something?
Oh,
like
God,
I don't know.
Have you ever had like an unseasoned boiled crawfish?
Well, I've never had a crawfish because I'm allergic to shellfish.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, so if I have one, I'll be dead.
Oh, that would be bad.
Honestly, we joke constantly that like if my enemies wanted to take me out, just gotta slip a shrimp into a sandwich, and that would be the end of me.
Don't give the mayor any ideas.
That's an ongoing joke about like how much the bounty has gotten to off me with a shrimp while I'm hanging out at a po' boy shop.
Oh, that's too bad because I was going to ask you whether or not you put other kinds of crazy things in your boil, but since you don't do
no, I mean it's been very interesting having a deadly shellfish allergy and growing up in New Orleans.
Your whole life it's been
whole
like
life,
that, right? Yeah,
whole life since I got identified with the allergy when I was like 5 or 6.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So
wow, you're just missing out on a whole big part of it.
Yeah, but a lot of family dinners where everyone else had jambalaya, crawfish, or gumbo, and I had a Happy Meal. So there's a very different experience growing up.
Wow.
My late grandmother used to always make gumbo, and she would make gumbo to a point and then scoop out my portion and then put everything else in.
Oh, that's cool though.
I mean, it is, but like their gumbo looked way more interesting than mine. Mine was like broth with rice, but I mean, it's just that's life.
You're eating like you're in Ohio, and they're eating like they're in
I was eating that gumbo soup they sell in Orange Beach, the gumbo soup.
Oh God, that's horrendous. Well, so one of the things I would want to talk to you about before we get into some serious kinds of things is you're a giant nerd.
Yes.
And so have you always been like a
I have been a
geek?
huge nerd my entire life. I kind of straddled two worlds, like the nerd and the not nerd world, in that like I remember in high school both playing soccer, running cross country, and playing Dungeons and Dragons. And you had to kind of balance it because those two groups of friends are very different. Mm-hmm. But it's just kind of who I was. And I mean, honestly, nerds have kind of come into their own in that we used to not be in, but now nerds and geeks are on the end.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's sort of like I feel like when I see new nerds and geeks, I'm like they're posers because they never dealt with all the stigma or the bullying. Now there's kind of everybody's welcome to be a nerd. And I was like, there was a time where you would get stuffed in a trash can for saying you like Transformers, but I mean, to each their own.
I definitely got chased about 6 blocks down the street as a kid, so for being into D&D and things like that. So
no, we were in the Dungeons and Dragons back when there was still Satanic Panic.
Yeah.
Where like parents were like grabbing kids who listened to Megadeth and Metallica and play Dungeons and Dragons and like having interventions and like holy water thrown on them. Yeah. So we were hardcore. Nowadays they watch Stranger Things and it's like it's all cool. They wear little cool shirts.
Yeah, I know, right? It's weird. I do feel kind of like salty about that a little bit, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, wow, how did you get away with this? But I had to get chased around. We had a priest that was like convinced we were all possessed by the devil.
I think it just made us more seasoned and more hardened in a way that these kids aren't. They're a little softer when it comes to their Dungeons and Dragons. But that's all right, though. I mean, it's nice that I can't say society's evolved because society is not evolved. No. But when it comes to embracing kids having weird hobbies, it's much more open.
What's your go-to character in Dungeons and Dragons?
honestly, and I hate to sound corny, but I love paladins.
Yeah, sure.
Which is really, really super corny. Like it's like super, super corny to be a politician. Like it's like the road answer. I mean, I wish this was something cool like a warlock or a rogue or something. But honestly, like that's just kind of what I gravitated to. I think it's more interesting when you have like sadistic, dungeon masters to play someone that's super not sadistic because it makes it more interesting. It goes very sideways if everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. Mine was always like a barbarian.
That tracks. That tracks. I mean, you kind of are a barbarian, so I mean, it completely tracks.
All right, Star Trek or Star Wars?
Star Wars.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you like Star Trek?
Not particularly.
Oh.
I mean, I like individual characters. I think Jean-Luc Picard is super interesting, but it's just like I feel like Star Trek is like super corporate.
Huh.
Like it's almost like Starship Troopers levels of like join the military, join Starfleet.
Yeah.
Whereas Star Wars, like every version of it is like you're rebelling against the established order of the Empire. Even when like they reboot, it's the same thing. Like it's always the authority that is overreaching is bad, and there's a band of scrappy heroes who are seeking to overthrow it.
It's interesting that you say that because conservatives in D.C., the generations running the place, like Stephen Miller types, those folks who I have the displeasure of knowing from when I covered Congress, he and guys like him, they actually, when they watched that movie, the first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, they cheered for the Empire. They thought the Empire were the heroes because it was religious terrorists that were trying to overthrow a government, and that is their whole vibe on it.
That also tracks. I mean, there's certainly people who I think more so like when you watch the newer movies who really identify with the Empire side. I mean, think about like in the most recent trilogy, it's like the Empire isn't around, but it's like resurging.
Yeah.
And there's definitely some parallels between like the fallen empire trying to retake over and kind of politics now. Like people, I want to say it was a 30-year lapse between the two trilogies. And it's like enough time had passed that people were wistful for the oppressive empire that was horrible and killing everyone. Mm-hmm. That's kind of interesting parallels between that and how things are now.
Well, and it makes me really question though, like a lot of the movies that we watched as kids, because like there were a lot of these movies like Escape from New York or like Big Trouble in Little China, like a lot of like John Carpenter movies and like these like sort of dystopian movies that were looking at like a world of like what happens when like our society kind of starts to collapse. And we all look at Snake Plissken and are like, well, that's the hero. But I start to wonder, like, were there other kids our age that were like, no, the bad guys in the government are actually the good guys, and they're trying to take the trash out, or they're.
I don't think well-adjusted kids saw it that way. I mean, I certainly think there's always a certain type of person that identifies with a certain type of theme. Mm-hmm. I remember when we weren't playing Dungeons & Dragons, we played a lot of Cyberpunk, which is like had a huge resurgence as a video game. But what was very interesting about Cyberpunk, it was funny because Cyberpunk, I want to say it was 2027. So like the game was in the 80s, but it had a dystopian view of the future in 2027 where corporations ran the world, which, it's very now. But what was super interesting is that like the characters were more based upon like their ideas of how they fit in society. Like you could be a corpo, which was a corporate chill, was actually a character class. And when I look at kind of now, it's like it's interesting how so much media was predictive. Like, I mean, if you look at like Back to the Future too, like the dystopian future of Biff.
Yeah.
I mean, even the fact that he was an evil like gambling magnate or whatever, like
and real estate guy.
So I mean, like, it is interesting how outlandish media was somewhat predictive in a way. And I mean, honestly, it's like when you look at it, it was supposed to be a cautionary tale, but it also kind of proved to be inspirational to people. Like, I mean, Stephen Miller being inspired by stormtroopers and the Emperor doesn't surprise me.
No, it's kind of obvious when you think about it.
I mean, honestly, like
it's a little too on the nose almost.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that when they storm the streets to put us all under martial law, that the officers are as bad a shot as stormtroopers.
Well, God, I do too. Although I don't think Troop NOLA is that bad of shots. So.
That's true. True that.
So, well, speaking of that, what is the status with that? And is this a permanent deal now? Are we going to just have like stadies like running around our community for eternity?
I think so. I mean, honestly, it depends on, obviously, the fate of Troop NOLA really depends on the legislature and governor's priorities. This governor has made security in New Orleans a priority, and so he's committed for Troop NOLA to be here. Obviously, I think there'll be an effort to secure a revenue stream to pay for it. Whether that will be through new taxes on tourists or the French Quarter, I don't know, but I would expect that at the state level, once a revenue stream is secured to fund Troop NOLA, a dedicated revenue stream, I would imagine they're here to stay. Because, I mean, once you dedicate the revenue stream, it becomes very difficult to undedicate it. So,
right.
I mean, I think it's a possibility. I mean, the reality is that there's always been this real tension. I mean, as you know or don't know, there's always been a tension going back to Huey P. Long about the presence of state police in the city of New Orleans and whether or not it undermines independence. For those of you who don't know, there was a time when Huey P. Long was governor where he would regularly use state police to either help legislators get to the Capitol or prevent them from getting to the Capitol, depending on what their preference was in regards to his agenda. And I mean, it's interesting to watch. I mean, it's an interesting just trying to see how you manage having two overlapping law enforcement agencies with concurrent but not concurrent jurisdiction. Because it's interesting because like in Jefferson Parish, each incorporated city has a police force and the sheriff's office is over it. And they both coexist because they're both still funded by the exact same government, which has some oversight over it. But the state troopers are super interesting because we don't have any oversight over them.
Yeah, well, I think they also, I feel like they did, in a Machiavellian sense, a very good job of how they introduced themselves into the city, because when they first brought them in last year, they didn't just sort of run out there on jump and start like arresting people and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. They kind of just were around and didn't do a lot, and I feel like that was a very smart tactical move on their part. I mean, I don't agree with it, but like, again, from a Machiavellian perspective, because now they've got, you know, they're chasing people around in their cars. We've had some accidents as a result of them in high-speed chases, but it feels now like they're just here and they're just part of the deal now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very interesting how they, as you said, like they came in at first kind of like as a visual show of force, that they started really with traffic. I mean, honestly, NOPD, our traffic division, fell apart pretty significantly under Mitch. And that really was mostly because there was that national and international fixation with traffic cameras. And it became cheaper to kind of just ban your traffic divisions and just collect the free cash from the cameras. And what was super interesting then was the city leaned so hard at traffic cameras and not promoting a traffic division that when the inevitable like rebound came and the state and citizens were like, no more surveillance with traffic cameras, there was no traffic division for the most part. I mean, other than escorting people in weddings and for second lines or parades, the traffic division kind of went fallow, and it created, really, I would argue, part of the real push to get Troop NOLA here, which began really kind of the idea of bringing state police in dates all the way back to John Bell. Was a lot of it was for traffic enforcement because NOPD just wasn't or couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But to your point, that role has expanded significantly beyond visual support and traffic enforcement to investigations and the like. And then you've got the weird kind of will they, won't they relationship between the DA and the Attorney General as far as if Troop NOLA arrests you, you're prosecuted by the Attorney General versus the DA, which just kind of really creates these two parallel tracks for justice, which as a former public defender is just odd.
Yeah.
It's odd, and it really, the type of experience you're going to have as someone who enters the criminal justice system is very different between a local DA and a removed Attorney General doing prosecutions.
Yeah, and I mean, especially with an Attorney General like ours, who clearly is politically motivated and thinks about things not from a real legal sense, but from like much more from a policy kind of an idea. Like, it feels like she sees her role as using the Attorney General's office as a way to enforce their particular agenda as opposed to just straight law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely is someone who feels facts. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like she's someone who like never lets a good narrative get in the way of a fact.
Yeah.
And so it is interesting, especially considering that like you look at historically what the Attorney General's office does. Like my time in the legislature, they were really focused on human trafficking and fighting child pornography and predators. And you don't really hear that anymore. Mm-mm. Like, I mean, it used to be when Buddy Call was there, even first term Jeff, you would see busts pretty much like on a monthly basis. But I don't know if they're not doing it anymore. I don't know if it's just not a priority, so they're not pushing it. I don't know if it's some Epstein, stuff where like maybe like somebody got caught and they're like, I don't want that guy to be in the news.
Yeah.
I don't know, but like they had a very specific lane and they excelled in that lane.
Well, she
but
seems to be
now
pretty
they're
busy
like,
trying to like arrest doctors in New York.
well, I mean, yeah, that's gone about as well as could be expected. I mean, it's just what I always find interesting about these efforts to do kind of long arm criminal prosecution is that that's a double-edged sword. And you could have people, let's say you've got doctors who are accused by a visiting New York family of interfering in their gender reassignment surgery. Well, do you want some doctor from Louisiana flying in New York to go see the Statue of Liberty getting hemmed up by New York cops and arrested? Will you have a press conference then? I mean, this idea that we're going to go into each other's states to enforce laws that we don't agree with just really seems like stabbing yourself in the face repeatedly. Yeah. But I mean, that's never stopped Louisiana from doing some kind of silly stuff.
I think, there's a lot of stuff going on in the city right now, and people are upset about a lot of things, I think. But I think one of the core parts of that is it seems like the administration has kind of checked out a little bit, and that a lot of the folks within the administration, it seems like, it's hard to. I'm trying to like a good way to describe this. I was talking with someone who works with like employees, just like regular sort of street level employees, and they said that they have found that not only are a lot of the people that the mayor has appointed especially over the last like 5 years, turned out to be kind of bad or not good at their job or abusive of employees, but it also seems to started to affect people who were around before her, or who used to be very good with their employees, used to be sort of the management itself has started to sort of collapse and get like a bit rotted.
I think that's probably an understatement. I think that I would say that there's a fine line between those people who were appointed through the last 3-4 years and the ones that went through confirmation. The ones that went through confirmation, all but one have turned out to be pretty good. Like Mr. Davis, who's over code enforcement, he's the reason why Plaza Tower is probably going to come down. Like he is dedicated to his field. And with confirmation, you almost gave people some kind of buy-in that they could do their job with the support of the council and the mayor, or with the council, however you want to look at it. The only person I would argue is probably our biggest fail as confirmation was probably Romy Samuel, the finance department person. She was a career city employee. We all believed that she would do the right thing as far as being more focused on making government work and not pushing the mayor's agenda. But she is the nexus point of this fake deficit the mayor's using to get out of this school board settlement. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's been a huge dereliction of duty insofar as when we press her for facts or for judgments, that have practical, factual support to justify the deficit, we get a lot of feeling facts. Like, I feel like you're spending too much money. Well, how is that happening? Like, you feel like our budget as a council is 1/10 of the mayor's budget. And when you talk to her and have her in there, she's fixated on 1/10 of the budget and not the other 90% that's completely out of control. So, I mean, I do feel like in every administration, and I can speak like, look at Jindal administration, for example, most competent people leave after the first term.
Yeah.
I mean, you have truly talented, competent people. They usually use the first term of an executive's term in office to like audition for a private sector job. And then when you get the second term, you get two types of people. You get people who want experience and want to audition for the next administration, and you get people who are so bad no one else will take them. Yeah. And I think a lot of the people you're probably thinking of or you're hearing about in the current administration who are truly bad are the ones that are so bad the private sector doesn't want them. What I do find interesting and very telling this administration versus I served at the end of Nagin, at the end of Landrieu. Most people knew that like as an administration is reaching the end of its term, the goal is not to set everything on fire because you have to leave that administration at the end of that term and go back to the private sector. There are a lot of terrorists, like Joker level terrorists in city government right now who do not seem to have that kind of thought process that me being terrible at my job, me being antagonistic with the council, with the public, being non-responsive, they just don't seem to think that there's a reckoning and that one day when they're no longer in government, first off, people are going to see what you did to government. But more importantly, future employers are looking at what you did to government. They're going, I don't want any of that in my business.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the school board thing. That whole situation has been bizarre to me because, frankly, like once the law was signed, even if she didn't like it, it doesn't really matter. It's the law. You're sort of required to follow the law.
Ideally, for most people, like part of what's been jarring for me is just that, like, as for government to work, everyone has to agree the law is the law, and that's both for the people in government and the people out of government. Because once you start saying the law doesn't apply to me, and you start applying that to everyone, chaos ensues. And I mean, whether she agreed with the settlement or not, the settlement was agreed with her knowledge. Her chief administrative officer came to a press conference and was like, yeah, we're all happy to do this. She changed her mind, and almost like, John, it would have been better for her to say, like, I just changed my mind. Instead, she manufactures this fiction of a deficit and us hemorrhaging money. And it's like the more the administration doubles down on that lie as an excuse not to give the school board the money they're owed under a very fair settlement that benefits the city and the school board, the worse it gets. And I mean, it just has created kind of this snowball awful effect where it really undermines people's faith in government in a real basic way.
Is there anything you guys can do to deal with this problem right now?
Well, I think first off, obviously, there's the lawsuit going on with the school board. Yeah. The council has joined it. But I think practically speaking, I think what we're looking at right now for the moment is part of the basis of the entire suit is that the city of New Orleans is illegally collecting a finance charge for processing the school board's millage. Now, the legal issue there, and I'm not going to go too much into the weeds because I'm a lawyer, is that if the voters voted to give a millage to a group, if there's going to be a finance charge, it has to be included in the millage because the voters didn't authorize the city to take out a finance charge. And that finance charge is almost $8 to $10 million a year out of the school board's pocket. So what the council is contemplating now, as we're going through the lawsuit to try and get the judgment ratified through the courts, is that we have the ability to go in and say, you know what, we don't agree with this charge. This charge is illegal, and we can bring an ordinance, and I'm introducing an ordinance to prohibit the finance department from collecting the charge. Now, that's not going to settle the lawsuit, but that at least allows the schools to go into next year with $10 million more of their own dollars back. When they're balanced in their books for 2026, for example, they'll have $10 million more dollars. And I think that will go a long way towards trying to repair some of the damage that was caused by the mayor getting out of the settlement. It obviously doesn't help the schools this year. And I know the school board itself is contemplating going into their cash reserves to try and bridge the gap, but finalizing the settlement, whether it's under this administration or the next one, and I do think that if we don't have a settlement finalized before the next administration, every mayoral candidate needs to take a stand on where they are on it, because there's an expectation by the parents, the taxpayers of the city, that this settlement needs to get done. But I think we're trying to figure out ways to bridge ourselves into the next administration to get this finally resolved, but that's what the council's going to do now.
Okay. Well, this on an unrelated but kind of related note. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of things that you guys have done, that the administration has done, that drag forever. And
Right.
one of the ones, certainly for me, because of where I live in the 7th Ward, that's always on my mind, is the Airbnb situation and those short-term rentals. And I think a lot of people are sort of saying, why hasn't the council just banned them at this point? Because it keeps dragging on. It seems like every 6 months
It's a fair question. I mean, honestly, I know when I talk to my colleagues, this latest lawsuit that's actually from Airbnb. I mean, they're very cute in that they put a bunch of shills up front and put their name last. But what's super interesting is, so the current regime where we have the 1 per square block with limited exceptions was really kind of a last grasp compromise where we're trying to balance, because obviously, like, it seems simple just to ban them outright, and obviously that would have been the easiest thing to do. But when we were going through that brief 3-month period to try and draft the law, we really were trying to not harm people who have been doing the right thing, which is why the compromise even happened. And no one had a problem with it, as far as like, I mean, people had a problem with it, but as far as like us trying to get to a regulated place where we could control the number of Airbnbs in a real finite way. What I found interesting is that we passed the law. We have one crazy lawsuit from a couple of people we always knew was funded by Airbnb, but not heavily. And what was the trigger point for Airbnb was platform accountability. So for those who don't know, we passed a new ordinance that says, so when we do enforcement, what happens is we find out there's an illegal listing, safety and permits goes out, they tell the person, you can't have that property, they send them their notices, they notify Airbnb and say, 1000 St. Claude has no permit, pull it down. What Airbnb has been doing before the law and during the law is that they go, okay, we hear you. And when that guy relists the next day, they put it back up. And basically it created kind of an untenable whack-a-mole where we were constantly having to re-notify Airbnb when we found that property had been relisted, and they kept just relisting the property. Now, I want to be clear to say I'm singling out Airbnb because VRBO doesn't do that. If we tell VRBO 1,000 ramparts in legal listing, they blacklist it. They go, we'll never list that property unless they show up with a permit.
That's interesting. I did not know that.
No, so like that. So, and when we're doing platform accountability, VRBO with Expedia actually was working with us on getting that language done, because so platform accountability closes the loophole of whack-a-mole. Airbnb's argument is, well, how do we know that person has a permit or not have a permit? They put a number in, we assume it's correct. Well, platform accountability, which we modeled off of San Francisco and New York, we create a platform electronically where if someone tries to list a property, Airbnb, VRBO, they're required to ping the city to make sure there's an active permit. Once that permit is identified, they list the property. It closes the loophole and puts the onus on the platform to actually check to make sure there's a permit. Because their initial argument everyone made is, well, if we have to call per property, that's too onerous. And so what New York and San Francisco did say, you know what, we're not going to do that. We're going to create a algorithm where you ping us electronically. It's instantaneous, yes, no. Airbnb lost their minds because once they realized that they couldn't keep relisting the same illegal properties and that the responsibility would be on them to make sure. Because, I mean, the reality is we probably have, with NSTRs, neighborhood short-term rentals, we probably have less than 2,000 legal permits. But when you go on the website, there's 6,000 to 8,000 listings. That's Airbnb listing 4 to 5 times the amount of properties on purpose. So we ended up in the middle of getting to the end of the first suit. Airbnb has now filed a new suit. And I'll tell you, for me and a lot of my colleagues, we're like, we don't want to be in perpetual lawsuits with Airbnb forever.
Yeah, well, that's what it feels like.
Yeah, I don't feel like, as obviously I'm running for re-election, but I don't feel like my successor in 5 years should still be dealing with Airbnb. Yeah. And we said when we passed the first compromise, the one we had, that was kind of the final one. We're waiting to see what the feds do, what Fifth Circuit does with our current law. And it seems like it should survive their scrutiny the first time. But if we can't get platform accountability done, I think for a lot of us, a complete ban is definitely on the table. Because the reality is that we're, for many
Could that not pass right now? Is that like the functional reality? Is it like you don't have enough members in the council?
I think that the challenge we have is a lot of people went through the lottery. They went through the exception process. And to do a ban because Airbnb is having a temper tantrum kind of screws all of them. The people that went through the lottery, went to all their neighbors, went through that whole thing. It's like if we knee-jerked it right now, I don't think the will is there. I would struggle with that just because so many people who are trying to do the right thing are doing it. But if we truly get to a point where it's because right now we have not gotten anything from the courts that shows our current process is bad. So everyone is trying to undermine it, but it's working. Mm-hmm. And platform accountability, there has been no stay of it, so it goes into effect in May. That's going to significantly drive down the amount of illegal listings. So for a lot of us, waiting to see how that stuff hits. But if we get to a point where any of the courts significantly limit our ability to regulate, then they'll cease to exist. I mean, you can't have people in neighborhoods being under siege from speculative owners or even local people who are just crappy Airbnb hosts. And as you know from the hotel motel industry, they're paying a tremendous amount of money in the system. They employ people. That whole, I know we didn't ask about that whole BZA decision where the BZA in this really bizarre kind of backwards position said that, you can have a hotel with no staff. I mean, that's commercial short-term rentals. That's just firing people and having an iPad check people in. And I mean, we've suspended and frozen all commercial short-term rentals for the last 2 years, trying to wait for a CPC report on that. But I think in the next 18 months, there's going to be a final resolution one way or the other. Because with the new Airbnb-funded lawsuit, it's really cutting off your nose to spite your face, because the Fifth Circuit has said over and over again, no matter what Airbnb that we can ban. Yeah. All the surrounding parishes can ban. And there seems to be this game of chicken in that Airbnb seems to think that a ban is not on the table and that they can dictate to us how to regulate short-term rentals. But what we have now is really the final compromise. If we can't regulate the way we need to regulate.
Well, when you mentioned these kind of like quasi fake hotels that are just right, and I mean, I think that it was smart for the council to deal with that. But there is a question. This is kind of, I think, that encompasses this, but it's a much bigger question. I think a lot of people are very frustrated that they feel like the city has just become the city government writ large, the council, the administration, the whole deal, is designed to cater towards the tourism industry and tourists at the expense of residents and of businesses that are owned by residents, small businesses, long-standing businesses. I saw a Facebook post the other day about Rawhide shut down on Bourbon Street, sort of out of nowhere, and it sounds like it was a lot of that had to do with like their rent going up and they were unable to continue to go forward or something like that, and it sort of prompted this discussion amongst people. They felt like, the things that what makes the city great and what makes the city worth living in, despite the fact that the roads suck and that the street lights aren't on and that ambulances don't come for a long time when you call one. Like a lot of the culture and life of the city is starting to has been commodified to the point that it's not for us, and the government is functioning that way. So, like, for instance, with that, like, the city comes in and says, well, okay, we're not going to let you build these buildings that are just filled with Airbnbs, and that's it, right? But in Treme, you essentially have just sort of a spread out version of that that's operating right now.
Right. Well, I don't know specifically about that Treme property, but what I can tell you is that I think that's kind of a pretty fair critique. I'll tell you, yesterday I was at Super Sunday, and I'm talking to the leaders of the Mardi Gras Indian Council, and every year without fail, they get harassed by parking enforcement, they get towed, and I mean, every year the council tries to intervene to try and resolve it. But to your point, there is a level, I can't even say it's like apathy, because I mean, like, it's sort of like how when you talk to people who run pedicab companies or drive cabs, they talk about how ground transportation will wear out a cabbie or a pedicab who has a permit, And yet you'll see guys zipping around downtown in golf carts or illegal pedicabs or like not even like gypsy cabs, like gypsy Ubers, and ground transportation does nothing.
Right.
And their argument always is, I don't have authority over them. And the fight we've had as a council with them is saying, listen, so you're saying you have the ability to enforce the law, and because it's too hard to enforce the people doing illegal stuff, you come down harder on the people doing legal stuff. That's both ground transportation, that's the finance department. They will hammer the crap out of someone who's a small business owner who has all his permits and still audit them. They will drop in on them. They'll find them. But a guy next door where operates something illegally and they kind of just turn a blind eye to it. Or like during these festivals when all these pop-ups happen, these are out-of-towners popping in to make a profit. They don't do anything. And it's like it's a patently unfair, unlevel playing field. But a lot of that's because, to your earlier point, things are at their worst in this city right now because when a mayor is checked out at the top, that level of apathy just flows through government. And I mean, I will tell you, this is my third mayor that I've served or worked with. This is the worst I've seen it. And I mean, it creates a level of hopelessness because when you've got a mayor who's not concerned about what happens to citizens, I mean, the council does what it can do. And I would argue that a lot of us have made this the most active council ever. But at the end of the day, we're thwarted by the courts frequently. I mean, you've got a court right now that says Judge Irons issued a ruling in the Troy Henry case where she told us not only could we not go against the mayor, but we always have to vote in her favor. It's very Trumpian. Like the legislative branch's job is to rubber stamp the executive. And that's kind of a battle we fight on a daily basis because for better or worse, we have a charter that creates a super powerful, like benevolent dictator of a mayor. And I've been gradually kind of working to undermine that because I think that's kind of BS. Personally, I think that when you vest all power in a single person in government, if that person is great, well, maybe you have a great outcome. But when that person's not great, it's chaos. And I've gotten a lot of pushback in this term, particularly when we did confirmation. People were very upset that I was trying to require confirmation of directors. And I got this argument from a lot of people, both in the business community in particular, but also people like in the regular community saying, well, listen, like, who are you to second guess a mayor's appointment? And the complaint that I always got was, well, there are really qualified people that just don't want to go through that process. And my response to that is, this is not a corporation. Part of the problem you have with a lot of these heads of departments that are truly bad is they don't believe they're accountable to taxpayers. They're paid by taxpayers, but they think they're hired in like X to be an employee. The mayor is Elon Musk, and as long as the mayor's happy, they can do what they want. And it's like, if you're a terrible head of public works and the streets are all jacked, it should never be that as long as the mayor thinks you're a good dude, that you should be safe in your job. It should be when you come into that job, you should have a public accounting of you are being given tremendous power in government. There's an expectation you'll be responsive, not just to the council, but to the public as a whole. And confirmation does that, whether you like it or not. But I mean, I think that's kind of a first step. I think there's other things we could do in government. The fact that we don't have line item appropriation in the budget is a train wreck because the libraries had $2 million in the budget to replace their roofs 4 years ago. That keeps disappearing. I don't think it's a secret that the mayor tried to rob the libraries of their millage money, and that it is obvious not fixing their leaky roofs is payback. That's because no matter how many times the council puts the money in the budget, once the budget's over, administrations move the money around like a jacked up shell game at Times Square. And in a lot of different governments, when the legislative branch puts money in the budget, you can't move it. But our charter gives flexibility to the executive to do that. And because of that, we have to constantly track money down that we thought we spent on something.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it at that. But thank you very much for coming in. This is great.
It was great. I wish we had more time to talk about Stephen Miller and the Empire and him being like, I don't know. Can't think of anyone terrible enough to be Stephen Miller and
Snoke.
Oh, yeah. Snoke was a clone of the Emperor. The Emperor is obviously Trump. I can see Stephen Miller as like a whack clone of Trump. So yeah, well, that works.
All right, well, thanks for coming in, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
All right.